Okay, well, welcome everyone. Today I'm your host, even though it says Ellen Jones. I'm Stefan T from the Geological Survey, South Australia. And we've got the privilege of having Janelle Simpson with us. Janelle is hailing from Queensland, from the Queensland Geological Survey. And she's talking about a really nice project that they did up in Mount Isa province. Janelle is a geophysicist there, a senior geophysicist, and has been involved in MT now for probably around about 6-7 years. Has done a PhD at the University of Adelaide remotely with Graham Heinzen. And I just want to give you also a little bit of background about the EMinars themselves. There's an EMinar website where you can see the link down the bottom. You can register for all your EMinars there, and past EMinars, you can also check out the video link. It will be on YouTube, where you can watch them. And we already have a list up well into the middle of the year for talks of offer. And just for the Zoom webinar etiquette, all of you will be much well aware. Please mute your mics if you can, unless you'd like to speak. We have a chat box down the bottom, but we prefer if you have questions during the webinar, please put them in the question and answer field. And then at the end of the talk, I will make them go live and have Janelle answer them. Just as a shout out for next week, we've got Ian Ferguson talking about nuts and bolts of MT instrumentation and field work. That'll be on the 9th of March at 15 UT. But going back to Janelle, I'm really glad to have Janelle talk to us about fantastic work going on in Northern Australia. So Janelle, I might just hand over to you. You've got all the time in the world, not quite, but
thank you very much.
Questions after. Thanks very much. I'll stop sharing, and then you should be able to.
Hopefully that's all good.
Yep, that looks good. Perfect.
And then can you see my pointer? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to give this talk. As Stefan mentioned, I'm Janelle Simpson. I'm with the Geological Survey of Queensland, which is a Queensland government department, part of a Queensland government department. Before I start today, I wanted to put out a lot of acknowledgements. So the work that I'll be showing today is not exclusively my work. There are a hell of a lot of people involved in it. And so I like to flash up as many as I can think of at the time. I'm sure there are more that I've forgotten, and I'm sorry to anyone I have forgotten. I also wanted to stop for a moment and think about how privileged I am to work with the First Nations people on a lot of this work. So when we're doing these surveys, we often get the honour of working with the First Nations people in the area, learning about their connection to culture and country, and understanding how they live their lives and what's important to them. And so that's one of the most rewarding parts of my job, if I'm honest. So I wanted to pay my respects to the First Nation people in Brisbane. So that's the Turrbal and Jagera people. That's the land I'm on today, but also all the First Nations people across Queensland that I've worked with and across the world. So if I think about where the Mount Isa province is, I realise that a number of people are probably coming from overseas potentially and probably have no idea where the Mount Isa province is or what its context is. So I thought I would give a very truncated overview of where the Mount Isa province is and a bit of its context and history. So it actually sits in Northern Australia, over here in the North Australian Craton, and the North Australian Craton occupies the top third of Australia, as you can see from the set here. We're up here in the north. It's an exposed Proterozoic origin. You can see the orange colour here is the Mount Isa province that sticks out of the ground. And then this blue unit that goes all the way around it is the younger Proterozoic basins that cover the Proterozoic origin for a large part of the area we're interested in. In addition to being quite old, it's also a world-class minerals province. So we've got both base metal deposits and iron oxide copper gold deposits in here, as well as some other bits and pieces. So it is very, very prospective for minerals, and that's why it's been a focus for not just us, but companies for a long time. If I would try and simplify the very long and complex history of Mount Isa into a couple of slides, I thought I would pick out the fact that the basement to the province is at least 1850 million years old, and it is exposed in parts of Mount Isa, but not very much. And then once we've, on top of that basement, we've deposited essentially 3 super basin packages. So this is the Leichhardt super basin, Calvert super basin, and the Isa super basin. And the Isa super basin in particular is host to the base metal deposits I talked about. And all of these basin sediments were deposited between 1790 and 1590 MA. And then after that has happened, we have an Eisen orogeny that runs for about 100 million years, deforms all of these packages and the underlying basement. And then once that's over, we start redepositing, or start depositing basin sediments again. So that's these relatively younger 1500 to 1400 MA sedimentary basins that sit around the fringes of the Himalaya, really. So that's in time space. If I look at a map of the Mount Isa province, it can really be broken down into 3 very large packages. So we've got the Western sub-province, unsurprisingly in the west. We've got the Kalkadoon-Leichhardt belt that runs down through the middle of the inland. And the Eastern sub-province, which sits in, unsurprisingly again, the east. So looking at these and the time space plots together, we can get some understanding of what might be going on in these different packages. So in the Western succession, these are the units of interest over there. And so we've got all 3 super basins in the Western sub-province, as well as the South Nicholson Basin, which sits up here in the north. And we've got some of these older basement units, particularly in this area down here, where we could investigate what the basement to these Mount Isa super basins are. In the middle of is the Kalkadoon-Leichhardt belt, which is actually a big intrusive belt. It's of an age of 1850 and sits between the 2 provinces, sub-provinces. And then in the east, we've got a more restricted expression of the super basin units. We still have the Eisen orogeny represented by the deformation in these rocks. And then we've got the Malungra Basin that sits out here on the eastern margin of Mount Isa. So very similar, but distinctly different assemblages in the east and west of the province. So I thought I would sit and think a moment about the challenges and the opportunities that we have in Mount Isa. So there are some pretty significant challenges that we face. And this is one of my favorite pictures to understand what these challenges are. And it's probably a little bit outdated these days. It can probably do with an update. But what you're looking at is this grey hashed area is the outcropping extent of these Mount Isa province rocks. And on the little black dots are all the known mineral occurrences, whether they're mined or just otherwise. And then around it, we've got the depth to basement. So this is from a FrogTech publication. And you can see that we're very, very good at finding mineral occurrences where they stick out of the ground. And then as soon as they go undercover, particularly down in this part of the province, they either go away entirely or we just aren't very good at finding them anymore. And I would suspect we're just not that good at finding them anymore. We do a better job over here in the east, but even then, the density of deposits that we can find in here is not anything like what we can find on outcrop. And with approximately 2/3 of this province covered by younger sediments, there is a big challenge there to try and understand how we can do better in covered areas. The expense of exploring undercover is obviously magnified, and there's a real difficulty in actually ground truthing interpretations where you don't have the rocks sticking out of the ground. So it's more expensive to ground truth them and more difficult as well. So these are some of the major challenges we face trying to understand the geology in Mount Isa. I do talk about cover a lot. In Mount Isa, we have a particularly unpleasant cover basin. I'm sure my petroleum friends would not agree, but the Eromanga and Carpenter basins are full of really conductive sediments. So I think this is one of the best images I've seen that shows in a visual way what the problem is. So this is actually an airborne EM survey. So this is done primarily by Geoscience Australia, but in collaboration with us. So we're looking from Central Australia up over Queensland into the Gulf of Carpenter. This is the outcropping extent of Mount Isa here in the dark blue colour. And then all the way around the province, we've got these very, very conductive sediments that sit at the surface or near surface and actually just eat all the signal in the electric space. So we have a really difficult time seeing through these cover basins with any electrical method, particularly an airborne electrical method, but also any ground electrical methods are harder than they would be elsewhere. So the opportunities, unsurprisingly, I think the opportunities are in the covered areas. Just because they're more difficult to explore doesn't mean there's nothing there. And we haven't found that many, so there must be some to find, right? So the fact that 2/3 of the province is undercover is also an opportunity. It's a very, very data-rich province. We're blessed with deep crustal seismic data. We have a lot of magnetotelluric data. We've got gravity and magnetic data. We've got company data.
Sorry, Janelle. A few people have been mentioning your microphone. Can you just check? There was some static noise or maybe some rubbing. Just see if
it could be the fact that there is a very large storm here. There's not a lot I can do about that. I can shoot over and close the back door. Maybe that will help.
Okay. Yep, no worries. Thanks.
Sorry, I'll be back in a moment.
Yep. That's fine. Janelle did mention that there was a big thunderstorm coming right towards the house.
All right, is that any better?
That's okay for me, but some people have commented on it, so we'll see how.
Well, hopefully that will fix the problem.
Yep, thank you.
Sorry about that, everyone. Where was I? Yeah, so there's a lot of data. There's also a very active exploration community. So there's a lot of very good company geologists doing a lot of good work in this area. So there really is a nice body of quality geoscientists to collaborate with and a lot of good data to work on. So it's quite a good province to work in. So if I kind of flick into thinking more about what's going on in the electrical and magnetotelluric space, we do have a very significant conductive feature in Mount Isa. It's even got a name. We call it the Carpenter Conductivity anomaly. It runs all the way down the eastern side of Mount Isa, as far as we know. It's been known about from 4 decades. It's not something that's new or exciting that I can tell you about that's never heard of today, but it is a very major part of our magnetotelluric program in Mount Isa. And To understand why we care about this, I've flashed up what is probably the most displayed magnetozoic inversion that I've ever seen. It's the Graham-Heinzen model from down in South Australia, and it really makes an argument that mid-crustal and deep crustal conductors can be intimately associated with iron oxide copper to gold deposits. So there's obviously a relationship at the Olympic Dam where you've got a deep crustal conductor and some conductive pathways that come up to major mineral deposits. And we have a very similar situation at least in Cloncurry, and other parts of this conductive anomaly are less well known. So it's possible that we've got this sort of situation all along the eastern side of Mount Isa, but we don't have enough data to really understand our conductive anomaly yet. So this is a big impetus for doing MT in this area. So the projects that we do primarily fall into either acquisition or interpretation. Often a project will be one and then the other. And I'll talk primarily about the interpretation projects today, but I thought I'd flip through the acquisition projects that we've done in recent history. So really the first big MT survey we did in Mount Isa was in 2014, 2015, which is a little while ago now. We collected 1,600 sites down here at the very southern, well, not the very southern, but off the southern end of the outcropping part of Mount Isa. And that was obviously a very large survey. And then we flicked our focus up to the north in around Cloncurry, where we have iron oxide copper gold deposits, and did a two-phase survey. So we did the first part of it in 2016, which was the southeastern part of the survey. And then in 2020, we went back and did another 500 odd sites up to the northwest. And then the most recent acquisition that we've done is along CF2 and 3. So down here in the south of the province, we've got these deep crustal seismic lines in white. And along those lines, we've collected some MT because it's a very nice complementary data set to try and understand what's going on in the seismic. And then we've got an upcoming survey, which I'll talk about the purpose of it in a bit more detail later in the talk, but all of these blue sites are for a survey we're calling the CCA MT Survey, which we'll be collecting this year. And then complementary to the stuff that we do in Queensland. So we do work with Geoscience Australia on these, but they are Queensland government initiatives. Geoscience Australia also have their own initiative ongoing, which is the AusLAMP project. For anyone who's not aware of that one, it is collecting long period MT at 55K station spacing across all of Australia. So we don't have a lot of AusLAMP data in Queensland at this stage, but we do have all of these blue sites over here have been collected. Most of them have been released. And then these black ones here are planned within the next few months with data release to follow. And then all the green sites are currently unplanned, but they will be collected at some point in the future, hopefully soon. So if I get into really what I want to focus on in this talk, it's the interpretation projects that we run in support of the data collection that we do. So the most recent one that we've run and completed is an interpretation project called the Deep Crustal Seismic Interpretation Project. And that's really based on all the deep crustal seismic lines you can see in white, with an important contribution from the MT data in the interpretation process. At quite a different scale, we've done a couple of depth to basement projects, one with CSIRO up in Cloncurry on this data set up here, and then another in-house one down on the ISO extension survey. And then we've got some more general modeling projects where we collect the data and then we do 3D inversion of that data set and then release those products to help industry understand the data a bit better. So the three that I will be focusing on today are the Deep Crustal Seismic Project, the work that we did with CSIRO in Cloncurry, And then as part of that, I'll discuss a little bit about these inversion models that we've produced. So starting with the Deep Crusted Seismic project. So this project really came about from an acknowledgement that we have a huge amount of deep crustal seismic across the Mount Isa province. We've got this beautiful interconnected network of deep crustal seismic that really crosses some very, very major structures at a number of places. So these red structures are very major terrane bounding structures. And we have not to date produced a cohesive interpretation of all of these. And so that seemed like a lot of money invested in seismic without really putting in the additional work required to do an interpretation. And so what we thought we could do is use this deep crustal seismic together with the gravity data and the MT data. So there's no new data acquisition, not much new data acquisition associated with this project, but really making the most of the data assets that we already have. And what we're trying to do is understand more better what these large scale structures are, where they go, and what relationships they have, especially to conductive anomalies, because that's got some implications for understanding fluid movement and the evolution of mineral systems, as well as the tectonic evolution of the whole province. So the project really was primarily seismic interpretation, a bit of gravity modeling, and then some geochronology to try and pin down some dates. This was the final product. There is quite a comprehensive report on the interpretation methods and all of the gravity modeling that was done. So we're actually looking at the full, almost the full suite of interpreted seismic lines as profiles across the province. This arrow here is our view direction. So we're looking up from the south across the full network of deep crustal seismic lines, with the exception of CF2s left out for visual clarity. It's worth a read if you are interested in the geology of Mount Isa, but I won't really go into much of the geological detail today. What I want to focus on instead is what the MT really contributed to this project. So this was kind of our starting point, understanding the big scale conductive structures in the province as part of the project. This is not my model, this is Geoscience Australia's AusLAMP model that they released in 2020. And you can see this very large scale, deep electrical signature in Mount Isa, where you've got a very conductive unit of structure down the eastern side of the inlier. And you've got a more resistive core, and then a very conductive, but a moderately conductive flank on the western side as well. This structure here is one that was a significant focus of the seismic interpretation project. So try and understand what the Gidja structure is. It has been variously interpreted as a suture and not a suture. So we've called it the structure, and we're trying to understand what it is and what its role is in the evolution of Mount Isa, and what its role is in terms of facilitating fluid flow through the eastern succession. But as wonderful as this model is, unfortunately, it doesn't cover the whole province. So this red dashed line is the extent of data that this model is based on. You can see there are structures down here, a suggestion of a continuation of particularly the Carpenter conductivity anomaly, but it is not very well constrained by the data, by the AusLAMP data that we have. But we do have this series of profiles that we can use now to think about how we extrapolate these structures further south relative to the big structures from the seismic. So looking at exactly that, this is a series of profiles here. So I've zoomed in a little bit, and I've taken a piece of MT data that is coincident with the seismic line for all of the seismic lines that cross the Gidja structure in yellow. So really trying to zoom in and understand what the conductivity signature of this structure is, or if it varies or not. Is it consistent? So if I start at the north, the Gidja structure is actually this big dipping lozenge shaped thing. And you can see in the upper crust, at least, there is a very compelling, very conductive association with the Gidja structure. And it's even more obvious in this inversion here. So these are MT inversions, not my MT inversions. So the ones that are marked with an asterisk are actually out of a published paper, which you can go and have a look at. It's a really good bit of inversion work. But what we've done is we've taken those existing inversions, overlaid them on our new interpretation line work and on the seismic to try and understand if there's a relationship. So this is the Gidja structure in this section here, and you can see it very well aligns with the very conductive structure imaged in that inversion. As we move further south, so this one here is right down here, we're just on the southern end of the Mount Isa, outcropping Mount Isa province. So it's one, the Gidja structure is this lower angled S-shaped structure that sits through here. And you can see there is a marked reduction in the intensity of the conductivity anomaly as we move further south. So there still does seem to be an association between this mid-crustal conductor, but it has reduced in intensity. And we're starting to see potentially mid-crustal conductors and upper crustal conductors that are associated with this main structure, but not part of it. And then as we step further south again, so this is the southernmost piece of data that we have. This is a very preliminary inversion that was done a little while ago now. But while it's a little bit less clear, if you can see, this is the Gidja structure here. So running along, again, this kind of low angle, slightly deformed S-shaped curve. And then we've got a broader area of conductive, moderately conductive crust underneath it, and these smaller conductors that come up on that. So there seems to be an indication here that there's a change from north to south based on a very small amount of data in the south. So this is something that I thought I'd step through in a bit more detail. So this is M6, which was that one right at the bottom of outcrop. This is the seismic interpretation that we came up with. And these are the various crustal blocks that sit in the lower crust based on our interpretation. Each one's got a slightly different history and consistent relative, consistent relative locations throughout the set of sections. But what we thought we could do is think about, if this is one of our major structures in the area, the Gidja structure here in red, what's the MT actually telling us? And then we took a go at trying to understand what the implications might be for fluid flow along this structure, because it is a crustal penetrating structure. There is a lot of magnetism in this area. And so we thought that there's probably a pathway here for fluid movement. And then in these strongly faulted areas that come up back off the Gidja structure, we see these conductive anomalies in the mid to upper crust. So there does seem to be a story here about fluid movement along this major structure, and it's probably contributing to the conductive signature of it. And then if I step to the southernmost one, again, this is not as compelling. So it's interesting that as we go further south, this relationship seems to break down. So there must be something a bit different going on in the south of the province. But broadly, a lot of these structures are still here. So we're 100 k's south of the section I just showed you. And it always sticks out to me just how similar these models are. So this one has an eerie resemblance to the one 100 k's north. Again, the Gidja structure highlighted here for us to have a look at. And again, there's this broad area of moderate conductivity that sits in the lower crust, and then some of these more mid-crustal or upper crustal conductors. Again, not as strong in this one, but they are associated with the same faulted packages. So these back thrust faults that come up off the Gidja suture and then into the eastern succession as well, in this very strongly, an area with very strong seismic fabric. So I think MT has been a really useful tool in helping to understand continuity of structures, but also understand what their implications might be outside of pure geological understanding. So thinking about what their mineral system implications might be. So based on all of that, so the work that we've done is based on these few profiles and also on this larger data block here, but we are a bit limited in our spatial coverage of data down here. So from this work, I think we can make quite a clear case that this resistive block, so I didn't focus on it in any detail, but this part of the inversions are always quite resistive, and they're associated spatially with this pitta block, which is a really high density lower crustal unit. So we've got this association between resistive and a high density unit. And so it's a very easy extrapolation to extend this resistive block down into the south of the province. So this is the current extent of data we have to understand where it might go, but obviously it'd be lovely to see where it goes down here. The conductive Carpenter anomaly, we would argue does continue further south, but looks like it reduces in intensity significantly. So it's still associated with the same part of Mount Isa, but it is less intense. I didn't cover it in any detail, but this western conductor also does extend down into this part of Mount Isa. So what we're really feeling is a lack of data coverage in the south. And so that's really what prompted the survey that we're going to be doing this year. So this one is the CCA MT Survey. I think we're actually out to tender and we're hoping to acquire this data, or start acquiring this data before June. But we're planning on collecting all these red sites. So really building up a backbone of data through most of the eastern succession, a few lines in the south to understand what happens as we cross this major discontinuity at the south of the Mount Isa province, and then a bit more detail along one of our existing seismic lines as well. So I'm excited to see the data for this one, and hopefully we'll get some more answers out of that about what the CCA is. But so I'll change gear a little bit. So this survey is like, this study goes from like the biggest possible study that we've done in Mount Isa to date to a very small, very focused depth to basement study, also using MT data. So we are up here, just north of the township of Cloncurry, just off the outcropping extent of the Mount Isa province. So the Mount Isa province sticks out of the ground in these red units. It's shallowly buried where we've got orange. This is our existing depth to basement surface, based primarily on drill holes. A little bit of airborne EM interpretation where we can get some penetration through those conductive cover sequences. We're interested in this area and we collected these MT surveys in this area because it's very prospective for IOCGs. It's got some really big terrain boundary structures. So the geotransect actually comes up in through this area here. It's less than 400 meters of cover, so it should be well within exploration depth. And there is a major mine here. So the Ernest Henry mine sits right in here in the middle of this first half of the array, highlighted in a white triangle. So we know that there is significant mineralisation through here. But there's always, we can always do a better job of depth to basement. It's one of those things that never seems to be quite finished. And so we've got this MT data. What can we add to our depth to basement understanding from that data? So this work was really led by Joel Salil, who works with CSIRO over in Perth. But he worked with us to put together a workflow where we use essentially a two-stage probabilistic estimation of basement depth. So there's an initial probabilistic inversion of MT data, and then there's a depth to basement surface estimation that incorporates drilling, which is also probabilistic. So stepping through that in a little bit more detail. So this is the first stage of the process where a 1D probabilistic inversion is generated for every site in the survey. There's about 470 sites in the first half of this survey that this study was done on. And it produces these probabilistic depth distributions. So that we've got a conductive layer here, which is the basin sediment, and then a more resistive basement that sits underneath. And here we've got the estimation of the depth to basement as a probability based on this inversion. This is a nice bit of code that Joel and some others actually put together for this study, or prior to this study, that allows, so we're doing 1D inversions. Obviously we have to adhere to the one-dimensional assumption inherent in the inversion, and if we've got two-dimensional or three-dimensional data, that should be removed before inversion. The nice thing that this inversion code does is it applies higher error weightings to areas that don't adhere to the 1D assumption. So we have to do less strenuous data pruning and still get good results. So once we've done all of those inversions, we extract all of the basement estimations out of the inversions. So that's all of these little black bars are quite certain basement interfaces, and these ones are more uncertain for each of these sites along the top. And this process actually does involve having some local knowledge. So you need a geologist involved in this process, because this is a simple inversion result where it's fairly clear that the basement interface is here, where you have a large step in resistivity, but there's also another little layer in here. So this potentially in other areas might be the basement interface, right? So you've got to have some understanding of the layering in the cover basin, but also a rough estimate of depth to basement already in your head, so that you can say 600 meters far too deep, 200 meters about right. Make sure you're getting the right interface. And then you take all of those estimates from each MT site, you combine it with some drilling data. So we do have a reasonable spread of drilling data in this area. And then you can also incorporate faults so that you can allow a step in the depth to basement surface across a fault. And then you fit a number of different possible realizations into all your estimations of where the basement interface is, and you end up with a final depth to basement with associated error estimation. So that's what this guy here is. So this is the average depth to basement surface based on that three-step process. If I look at these two sections, so this is the north-south section here, and this is the east-west one. I've just pulled out these two top ones where we've used the MT and the faults and the drilling, and compared it to just the drilling and the faults. So really trying to work out what extra information the MT is providing us. And I think you can see that particularly in through here where we've got our MT data, the fuzziness of this interface is reduced. So that means our certainty of where that depth to basement interface is located is more certain. And like, especially in this area here, we're seeing improvements in the estimation of depth to basement by adding MT to this. So these red bars are the actual drilling data. So it's quite sparse, but very detailed in some areas. So the MT really helps us extrapolate between these sites quite well. So I in particular thought this was quite a successful project. I think one of the reasons it works well is that we've got quite a dense array of sites. So these are 2 kilometre station spacing MT sites. It allows us to not worry as much about how far we can extrapolate these results. So interpolating site to site is not too bad. We're actually expanding this program. So we've done the sites down here in the southeast, but we'll be doing these ones up here in the northwest over the next year. And I am excited to see if we can get similar results. That's going to start up in the next few months. And then the last one I'll talk about today is the work we're doing on, again, exactly the same data set, right? So because of the data that we've acquired in this area has quite a wide band of frequencies covered. So it goes all the way from 10,000 hertz down to generally 1,000 seconds. So some sites is a bit more, some sites it's a bit less. Some of the data collected in 2016 is probably a bit noisier than the stuff up to the northwest. So we are expecting better results out of the depth debasement to the northwest. But obviously when we're doing the depth debasement study, we're only really using the top maybe 4 decades of data. So there's another part of this whole data set that we can invert to understand what's going on underneath the basins, looking for upper crustal to mid crustal structures, and trying to understand what the electrical structure is in this area, potentially what the signature of these major faults is. And so there's 1,000 sites here. So this is quite a large inversion task, but we are doing some 3D inversion of this data set to try and understand what's going on in the area. So a little bit more detailed context for this area. This is the interpretation from the seismic interpretation project. And you can see in this area, we're actually, so this new data array, the full data array sits in this black box. This is where we roughly have resolution with this data. We're sitting in this area on top of the Gidja structure, which is very conductive. This is only a 2D inversion, a very early 2D inversion using some of the sites along the seismic line, but also some of the flanking historic data. Try and see what's going on in more detail in this area. So we've got this very conductive package of rocks that sits within the Gidja structure. And then we've got some indication in here that there's some more isolated conductive features that come up off this structure, similar to what we see in the south, but obviously a lot further north. So there's a lot of 3-dimensional data in this array. So 2-dimensional inversion is not really that appropriate unless you truncate it quite heavily. So we are going through and doing 3D inversion. So this is some previous work on the first half of the data array. So you can see these sites in this roughly triangular pattern. A lot of you have probably seen this, but it really illustrates why we bothered collecting the rest of the survey, and also gives you a feel for what kinds of structures we can expect when we're inverting the full data set. So this is, again, work done in collaboration with Geoscience Australia. And we've got a couple of major features in this inversion. So we've got a big eastern conductor that wraps down the eastern side of the array that merges into a very large mid-crustal conductive region. And this is very consistent with what the AusLAMP tells us, just in a bit more detail in the upper crust. And then we've got these isolated conductive anomalies that sit out here in this resistive block. And so this one in particular was a very well publicized inversion result, and it's because it's spatially associated with Ernest Henry. So looking at an isosurface of that same inversion, you can see that Ernest Henry sits up here at the surface. E1 is another IOCG type deposit in Cormorants and exploration prospect up to the north. And you've got this conductive pipe-like structure that comes up and is spatially associated with the mine. So it comes up all the way from the mid-crust, where it's very conductive, into the upper crust. And obviously it caused a bit of a stir and was a really nice prompt for us to expand this survey, because if we look at the magnetic data, so down here in this corner, these are the sites on the magnetic data. There's a very distinctive set of magnetic signatures that are associated with the rocks here, and they obviously continue up into the northwest, but they're not covered by the first half of the MT survey. So there's an expectation here that we will be looking at similar rocks, might see similar features, but we don't have the data there yet. And so that's why the survey was expanded. So this is an in progress inversions. So I'm going to put a lot of caveats on these structures and then tell you why I think I should bother talking about them. So because it's in progress, I've included the RMS plot. We're only down at an RMS of 3.3, so not great yet. And you can see there are some systematic misfit problems. So there's a couple of dodgy sites here, brown sites that probably need a bit more data cleaning. And then there's some systematic misfits here where you've got clusters of sites that are not fitting as well as some other parts of the model. So this tells you that there's potentially structures that are not being resolved very well yet by this survey, by this inversion. And something else to keep in mind is that the longer periods are not fitting as well as the shorter periods. So the deeper parts of this model are less representative of the data that we've collected. So having said that, all of these structures that I can see in these depth slices, particularly these first two, are very consistent with the structures that you would expect based on the data analysis. So when you're doing phase tensor plots and tipper plots, you can see these big conductive structures that wrap down each side of the survey. I would argue that you can see an indication that there is a conductive feature in here as well. So I was expecting this to pop up in inversions. Despite it still having quite a high misfit, I think there is something there. I think the inversion is simply not resolving it appropriately yet. And my suspicion is that the mesh is too coarse to actually resolve this to the level it needs to match the data. So that's something I have to think about with subsequent inversions with a bit finer mesh. This is a joint tipper and impedance inversion, and we're using most of the data. So we're using all the way from 1,000 hertz down to 1,000 seconds longer if we've got it. So really making the most of this good data set. But I think, so this is the part of the model that should resemble the 2016 inversion results. And we do still have this conductive feature that wraps up the side. We're starting to see these smaller conductive features being resolved inside this larger resistive block. So this seems like it's heading in the right direction, and they're quite exciting inversion results to me personally. So if I take a couple of sections out of this guy, it's roughly evenly spaced. We're at vertical exaggeration less than 1. So these structures are shallower than they should be. They dip more steeply in reality. This part, it's hard to see, this part of the inversion model is where the Gidja structure actually sits. So it should be a west dipping structure that sits down through the eastern margin of all of these sections. And to the north, I think you can see we've imaged it quite well already, even though this inversion is not finished yet. And then in the south, we're seeing a more moderate response. So whether or not this reduction in conductivity to the south is real is a bit questionable in my mind. But we are seeing something here that makes sense. And then if we look over to the west of the array, this is actually a new structure. So we could see this when the data was coming in, but we didn't know it existed before we collected the data. And it looks like we've got a very strong conductive anomaly associated with the fountain range fault. So the fountain range can be fault depending on how far along the strike of the structure you are. And this does seem to dip back down into this mid-crustal conductor. It does have a much shorter extent, and at its southern end, so down here, it looks like it's primarily an upper crustal feature rather than this really big structure that it is further in the north. So that one is going to take a little bit more understanding, and I'm looking forward to having that resolved a bit better in the final inversions. This is work that we're doing collaboratively with a couple of other people as well. So we'll be working on this one over the next couple of months. So that's a lot of information, a lot of projects, and quite a lot of talking, if I'm honest. I thought I would try and summarize it into what to me are the key takeaways. So we have used a lot of MT in Mount Isa over the past 6, 7, 8 years, however many years it is. We've acquired a lot, we've spent a lot of money acquiring those surveys, and we've done it at a range of scales. So I think one of the most useful things about MT is the variety of scales you can investigate with the data. So I've shown you all the way from a top couple hundred meters depth to basement study, to looking at large-scale crustal structures and conductive fluid movement along those structures. Geoscience Australia obviously has a really strong focus on modelling their AusLAMP data, and that tells us about the lithospheric structures. And then something I didn't touch on, but there are a lot of companies using MT in this area as well, and they're using it for detailed exploration and potentially drill targeting too. So it's been used at all scales in this area. And to my mind, one of its really big selling points in Mount Isa is it helps with our very conductive cover problem, and also helps see through deep cover. So obviously our airborne systems are not getting through this, but that doesn't mean there's nothing underneath that conductive cover that we want to see. So MT is a beautiful tool for getting through that problem. And I think, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, but one of the real strengths that I see in MT is that I can do a study where I'm interested in the upper crust and the mid crust and the deep crust, and use MT to investigate all of those scales. Like it's a versatile tool, and that's how we're using it in Mount Isa, to try and investigate a range of scales. So I will leave it there and ask for any questions.
Thanks, Janelle. It was a wonderful talk. It's always good to see the raft of results coming out of it. It's really fantastic. We do have one question at the moment, and that's from Nick Williams, and he is asking, for the probabilistic depth to basement models, is it important to define the positions of the faults as a prior, or can you run the model without faults and use the results to infer the positions of the faults?
So I think we did do a run of the depth to basement estimation that didn't include the faults, just to see what the difference was. And for most of it, it's fine. Like there's not that much different, but there are a couple of points in the model where you have a really difficult, so you end up with quite unnatural looking depth to basement surfaces as it tries to warp the depth to basement along where there's faulted offsets. So you can definitely do it with and without and see what the difference is. And indeed, that was pretty interesting to me.
Yep. Great stuff. There's another one by Alan King. He says, hi, what do you think is causing conductivity? What a broad question. But yeah, choose whichever level you would like. I suppose he's related to the crust mostly.
Yeah, I would think so. So in the basins, it's not as much of a surprise. There's some conductive saline groundwater, and there's some very conductive carbonaceous shale clay units, which are in the Eromanga Basin. So I suspect the question is more about the big crustal conductivities. And if I knew the answer to that question, I would have so many papers. I think this is one of those ongoing questions where we don't have an answer. There's possible answers, like in the upper crust, it could be sulfides, and particularly where you're looking and the anomalies associated with Ernest Henry, or Ernest Henry might be sulfides. The one a bit further north along the Fountain Range fault, there's actually some graphitic shale basins in the basement up there, which I think are probably contributing to some of the upper crustal signature, probably not the full upper crustal signature, and probably less so as we go deep. So the really super conductive part of the Gidja structure is a really interesting one. I've been speculating with some colleagues that maybe there are some conductive sediments, seafloor sediments that are entrained along that. If it's a suture zone, there might be a contribution from serpentinization of these rocks. There could be graphite down there. Like I don't have, I have a coward's answer, which is I don't know.
Yeah. I also noticed, I might just follow up on that you had one slide where you had the TMI image, so the magnetic on the bottom left, and then you had the MT on the right. I think it was for the entire Cloncurry survey, if I'm not mistaken. But I was just wondering, there were zones of low magnetic intensity, the sort of bullseye things. And you always wonder what they are if the rest is magnetized, right? Whether it's sort of a little oxidized zone, etc. Does that correlate with the conductors at all? Did you have a chance to see that? To check?
I haven't looked at that in detail. That's a good question. I think the scale of the MT is possibly a bit coarse. Are they looking at it now? There probably is. There is some information you can get out of that. There has been quite a detailed study done by Jim Austin at CSIRO again, looking at magnetic anisotropy and remnant magnetization associated with Ernest Henry. So we would have some of that information about what those magnetic lows are. And he also goes into discussing redox states and how that all impacts.
Yeah, that's right.
Deposits. So yeah, there probably is something there that can be unpicked. I have not done it.
Yep, okay. No worries. Next question is by Ned Stoltz. Will the CCA MT survey be broadband, long period, or a hybrid? So basically asking for the frequency range of the.
Yeah, so my intention is to collect that, I don't know what the right label is, from 10,000 hertz to 1,000 seconds. So some people call that wideband, some people call it broadband, but I want all of the, so really, the sites are at about 10K station spacing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to collect that really high frequency data, but it's a future-proofing thing. The idea is that we'll go back and infill this at a later date, can also be used for helping our depth debasement. So we really are targeting the high frequencies all the way down to 1,000 seconds. And then as part of that, we are trying to clear some OSLAM sites as well so that we can hopefully get those collected. So everything is what we want.
Perfect. I don't have any questions at the moment anymore, but I do have some. I was just wondering with the 2D profiles that you showed, were all of them so 2D, 3D inversions, or was there a mix between them?
So they were all, so those profiles stepping through the gigastructure, they were all 3D inversions. So when Peng did those inversions down at Geoscience Australia, and she did a 3D inversion with ModEM along each of those profiles.
Yeah.
And then the one all the way at the south that I have done that is not as polished is also a ModEM 3D inversion.
Okay, 3D, yeah. And so a follow-up would be, you know, I think that the Geotransect, as we call them in Australia, where you have seismic and MT along the same profile, is really useful just to kind of see how they correlate. And, you know, you've spent a lot of time explaining you had a very discrete feature in the mid to lower trusted Gidia zone and how that controls fluid movement. What we also found is that there are zones that have a low reflectivity in the seismic reflection correlate with higher conductivity. Do you see something similar in your profiles? I noticed it was a little bit hard to see because you had interpreted sections.
Yeah,
We
once you put an interpretation on it, it's stacked.
Yeah. Do you have that as well? That especially in the lower to mid crust, that, you know, where you have the conductors, the reflectivity actually reduces? Is that, you observe that?
I'm sure we do. I do remember because I looked at it and I was like, oh, there's examples of something like that in South Australia. I cannot off the top of my head remember where, but I'm sure in somewhere in the network there are examples where you've got very subdued seismic reflectivity character and increased conductivity. Yeah, I would have to flip through my notes and find where, but yeah.
I think that also has an influence on how you explain the connectivity anomalies, you know, that they're actually sort of permeating through the entire structure a bit.
Yeah.
Net has a question here. Just going to lie for that. Does the Gidia structure outcrop? And then the second one, does it have a gravity contrast across it? I suppose where the outcrop is.
It doesn't outcrop as far as I know. Yeah, I think I can safely say that. It does have a gravity contrast. So I was involved in part of the seismic project was a very extensive set of 2D gravity forward modeling, which took a long time to make consistent across the full network. But there is a definite gravity contrast across that structure. And whether it's the structure or the rocks either side of the structure varies a little bit. It's not got a very clear, consistent signature across the full network, similar to the MT. It seems like it's a major difference, but that difference is not always the same, if that makes sense.
Good stuff. Dennis Woods has a question. Care to speculate on the connection from the CCA to the Flinders deep conductivity anomaly? I suppose the question, what it means is that the Carpenter anomaly in Australia has been, first been shown with induction errors from a really, really broad national data set where it extends from your area down to where we are in South Australia. The Flinders deep conductivity anomaly is just a bit north of Adelaide. Janelle.
I would love an answer to this question, and that's part of what the new survey is going to tell me, because the key point to making that prediction is understanding what happens at the south of the Mount Isa province. Like if it continues across that big diamantina structure that truncates the magnetics and the gravity and all the structures at the south of Mount Isa province, if it continues across there, it's obviously a younger structure. It's got a very different interpretation. But if it stops there, it won't connect to the Flinders one. So if I had to, gun to my head, make a prediction, I think it's a combined anomaly where some of it is unique to Mount Isa, but a larger, a more moderate part of that anomaly will continue south, because there is quite a large temperature anomaly that runs down under the Cooper Basin that would, in theory, enhance the conductivity as well. So I think we're going to see a little bit continue down and maybe connect to South Australia, but not really the interesting part of the anomaly.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Janelle. We do see some signatures in the mid to lower crust that Kate's done for her, Grant has done for her modeling. And that's in the Cooper Basin, so in the northeastern part of South Australia. So that's not too far away where you're going to do your survey. So it'll be interesting to see, that they almost join up then, and you can make a guess about that. Don't have any more questions from the chat. I think maybe one question I would have then is, you already talked about the TMI, but if you had the same amount of money again, I think you highlighted towards the end of your talk about the beauty of MT is that you can go across scales so easily. But exactly what the right spacing is, Ausland is 50 kilometers, your grid is 2 kilometers. It's not something that we've done in South Australia. But what are your reflections on if you were to do it again? Are you happy especially in your terrain with your depth to basement with the kind of site spacings, or would you do something different? It's the kind of question is, especially for us surveys, if you want to explore into a completely new terrain, what's the right approach of scale reduction, and what are the good spacings? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. So I constantly feel like I'm treading some middle ground where I never collect MT detailed enough for a company. They're always telling me that it would be nice if you could just increase your resolution a little bit. But at the same time, I do occasionally get some criticism for surveys that are too closely spaced. I'm not covering enough spatial area. I'd be better served to do a more regional survey first. And I think it really doesn't have a single answer. So for the surveys that we've done, the one down in the south of Mount Isa, the Isa extension that we did first, that was a very detailed survey. That's 2 kilometre station spacing across the lines and 5 kilometres between the lines. That one, I think we probably, in hindsight, we could have done that one more coarsely. It did lead to companies picking up tenure, so you can't be that mad about it. But for the amount of information we got out of it and the implications for exploration, it probably was a bit over like too dense. In the Cloncurry area, obviously 2 kilometre regular grid is higher resolution again, but there was some pre-existing data in that area at Ernest Henry that told us that there is likely to be some interesting conductive features up there. It's shallower, it's more explorable, and so like the depth to basement in an area helps me determine how widely I'm going to space my stations. Also an expectation of whether or not there's anything interesting there. So in Cloncurry, I wouldn't change anything. And then for this upcoming one, I think we've got less knowledge about what's going on throughout the Eastern Succession. It really is more of a framework study. where we're going in, collecting an initial set of data, more like you would do in an unknown terrain, trying to build that framework and then go back with subsequent surveys and really image stuff that's interesting. So it's kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish with the survey and what knowledge you already have.
Yeah, I mean, but it's certainly impressive that you can collect 1,000 MT sites. So it's a good number. For government.
I didn't know it was going to be so round when I did it, and I was real pleased.
Yeah. Very, very good. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A, and I might just leave it there. So once again, Janelle, it was a fantastic talk, a really nice overview of what's going on up north. Really enjoyed it. And for everyone else, thanks for joining in. We get some comments coming in for a great talk that you gave. And I just want to highlight next week, we've got Ian Ferguson from Canada giving a talk. So that will be at 1500 UT on the 9th of March. So please join in for that. But if there's no more questions, I might leave it there. So thanks everyone for joining. It's been another great EMinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. See you.